You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, I think you would agree that it's really difficult to get us surprised at something that's happened at the hands of this administration. What we're about to talk about today is exactly that, to the nth degree. We've spoken about these alleged gang members who were deported to El Salvador with no due process. And the worry in the lead up to this, as we've been discussing this, is that there are folks who've been rounded up who were rounded up in error, who didn't deserve to be there, who aren't the gang members that they are accused of being. And now we have proof of exactly that in a story that is perhaps one of the most frustrating, infuriating, and sad things that we will ever talk about. Can you explain what happened here?
You know, Brian, this is exactly what the due process clause of the Constitution is designed to prevent. And Donald Trump just virtually shit all over the Fifth Amendment due process clause. And here's what happened. A young man by the name of Kilmar Garcia, who is a legal resident of the United States, and who actually had a court order protecting him from being deported to El Salvador, issued by a judge in 2019. We just learned that as part of this, mass roundup and stuffing into planes of alleged Venezuelan gang members, they snatched up this young man who happens to have a wife, a 5-year-old special needs child. Both he and his wife work full-time, according to the court filing. And I'll say it again, he had the protection of a court order saying he may not be deported to El Salvador, in part, Brian, because in 2011, Kilmar fled El Salvador, where he was being pursued by the gangs. His parents were being threatened and extorted by these gangs. He fled here, and he was not to be deported back to El Salvador. And the Trump administration and the ICE officials didn't care. They stuffed him on a plane with no due process as guaranteed by the Constitution, and they sent him to a notorious terrorist prison in El Salvador. How do you think he will fare down there now that he has been unconstitutionally sent to the very country he fled and the very country a judge ordered he not be deported to?
And that leads to my next question is this tantamount to, this guy has a family, and so I don't ask this lightly, but is this tantamount to a death sentence for this guy?
Yeah, you took me right where I was not wanting to go. When I say he's not going to fare well being returned, to the country from which he fled and being stuck in what is reportedly one of the most dangerous prisons where torture of prisoners is reported to be a regular occurrence. And here's the kicker, Brian. Let's add insult to injury to outrage. The Trump administration is now telling the court two things. Whoops, it was an error. Sorry, we shouldn't have done it. And we don't think we have a mechanism to bring him back. Are you effing kidding me? So they are basically happy to have whatever is about to happen to, Mr. Garcia down in that El Salvadoran prison. And they can't even be bothered to defend themselves. They just said, you know what? We're going to chalk this one up to an administrative error. You know what? You believe that? I'll bet Donald Trump has got a bridge to sell you. He'd probably throw in a couple of tunnels.
Right. That's the thing. Are you telling me with all the agreements that we have with El Salvador that allows us to just, without any due process, deport these people to their country, we have no mechanism whatsoever to bring back somebody who is a legal resident, who is there as the result of an administrative error, that we have no mechanism to bring that guy back?
I don't believe it. You don't believe it. But that is what the attorneys who are in court, not exactly defending this action, because they concede they did not have a legal reason to deport him, a legal basis. They're also saying, we just don't think we have a mechanism to bring him back, which sort of runs contrary to what other DOJ lawyers have been saying to, for example, Judge Boasberg in the litigation surrounding the illegal deportation of Venezuelan migrants. They're saying things like, well, we have such a good and strong and robust relationship with the El Salvadoran government that if you interfere in that, Judge Boasberg, make us return people, it really might harm national relations. Well, if you have a good, strong, robust relationship with that government that is housing prisoners that you illegally deported and sent there, seems to me you could pick up a damn phone and say,
right,
send this one back, we done screwed up.
Okay, well, Glenn, I'm going to ask a question that I don't presume that you're going to have the answer to here, but I'm going to try to channel the voice of our viewers, and that is to ask, like, how can this happen, and what can happen next? I mean, this is so overtly, this is not much different than you or I just getting disappeared to another country. And so I know everybody's asking, how can this happen? And everybody's saying, this can't happen in this country. We can't just have processes where you disappear people like this is Russia. We have due process. We have a court system. And so what happens next? Because I understand there's a difference between this can't happen and okay, but it is. And so really I'm having trouble reconciling the complete dissolution of the rule of law within those parameters. But can you kind of walk me through what should happen, what will happen, and how we could be here?
Yeah, what should happen and what will happen, there's probably an ocean between those two things.
Right.
What should happen is our executive branch, our federal government, the Trump administration should move heaven and earth to get this wrongly deported man who is now in harm's way, who had the protection of a court order prohibiting this, and who had constitutional due process rights that were trampled all over. Our government should move heaven and earth to get him back promptly, and get him back safely. Will that happen? This is the Trump administration. I actually think Donald Trump is celebrating, maybe quietly, maybe pretty soon loudly, because if you'll remember, it wasn't that long ago that he posted that he was willing to terminate the Constitution. And Brian, he has put his money where his mouth is. And I don't want to turn this into a legal breakdown law school class, but very briefly, Kilmar Garcia had due process rights. What does that mean, right? That sounds like a very kind of vague and uncertain term. But here is what it means. There are 15 words in the United States Constitution in the Fifth Amendment, and they are, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. What does that mean? Well, if before you can be sentenced and imprisoned, due process means a whole heck of a lot. It means you got to be indicted. It means you get an attorney appointed to you if you can't afford one, and that attorney under the Sixth Amendment must provide you with zealous representation. You have a right to a jury trial. You have a whole bunch of rules, procedures, and laws that govern what that jury trial must look like. You have a right to a unanimous verdict by a jury. You have a right to a full and fair sentencing hearing before a judge pronounces sentence. Those are all due process rights. But when it comes to deportation, something like this, you know what your due process rights are? They're very simple. They're not burdensome. Basically, two rights. You have the right to notice from your government before your government does this to you, and you have a right of an opportunity to be heard. And Brian, all Donald Trump's administration had to do was take Mr. Garcia before a judge, and he and his lawyer could have held up that 2019 court order protecting him, prohibiting our government from deporting him to El Salvador, and he would be home with his wife and his 5-year-old child right now. But the Trump administration didn't care. They didn't do it. I'm not buying it was an administrative error. The cruelty and the arbitrariness is the point. Why? So he can deter lots of other folks in lots of other ways. So Donald Trump wanted to terminate the Constitution. Well, it looks like, he may have had his way with the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process of law.
Right. I completely agree. I think that this isn't necessarily about this one specific person. This is about Donald Trump showing his detractors that he is exactly as all-powerful as he perceives himself as being. And so he doesn't care what person he has to steamroll through in order to get his way. He's trying to send a message, and everybody that gets hurt as the result of that, that's that's just collateral damage. He's not worried about what happens to 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 or hundreds or thousands of people on the road to him showing that he is capable of consolidating power. The goal here is the chilling effect that this will have in terms of people saying, oh, if I stand up to this guy who has consolidated all of this power in the executive branch, I'm gonna get plowed through. That's really his goal. And so he was able to do that by virtue of sending this guy away. So to your exact point, he's not looking to bring him back because the fact that he can be disappeared in an extrajudicial way is the point unto itself. It's not about this guy. It's about Trump being able to display his power. And that's
Brian,
that's the sad part of all of this.
Yeah, and let me just try to give you a more concrete answer to your original question. What can be done? Desperate times call for desperate measures. Judges can certainly push envelopes, but they can't push them beyond the law or the Constitution. But one thing that does come to mind is, listen, the Trump administration and these ICE agents that engaged in this unconstitutional deportation violated a court order, violated a judge's protection order saying Mr. Garcia cannot be deported to El Salvador. One thing the court has available to it is the power of contempt. And if a court wanted to inspire the Trump administration to get a plane down there to El Salvador and bring this man back, the judge could say, I am going to begin to hold everyone in contempt who was part and parcel of this unconstitutional deportation that violated a judicial order. And you know what? You want to purge the contempt? You just go ahead and bring Mr. Garcia back pronto. And then maybe I will consider, releasing you all from contempt. There are things that can be done. They're not usually done because push doesn't usually come to shove. Traditionally, the executive branch will relent if they are caught red-handed doing something this wrong, this unconstitutional, and this contrary to a court order, and they will try to make it right. Well, if they're not going to make it right, then the courts need to pull every tool out of their toolbox to try to force the government's hand, force the Trump administration's hand.
Glenn, what do you make of the fact that Trump's literal first act in office was to release 1,600 insurrectionists because their political ideology comported with his, and yet will not manage to lift a fucking finger for this guy who was knowingly wrongfully deported to a foreign country, one that he himself fled because this guy is brown?
My view of the Trump administration and where our nation is right now, Brian, is that crime is on the rise. Unfortunately, that crime is being committed in the Oval Office by Donald Trump when, for example, he is having judge after judge rule that, let me just use this as one example, his executive orders retaliating against law firms because they displease him in one way or another, they are unconstitutional. And the next day, when he comes in off the golf course, he signs another one. What is he doing? He is acting in a knowing and intelligent, he is acting knowingly by continuing to sign executive orders that have been deemed unconstitutional. If that's not a complete abdication of the responsibility of a president to take care that the laws of the nation be faithfully executed, for gosh sakes, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I could not have said that better myself. We will leave off there. And Glenn, as soon as we have any update, of course, you and I will come back and bring this to the folks who are watching right now. For everybody who is watching, look, it is clear that we are in uncharted territory when it comes to the illegality of this administration, which underscores the importance of making sure that we have folks who are willing to speak out. We try to do that on a daily basis. So if you want to support our work and support independent media more broadly, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.